the entire media political set in Ireland are essentially friends, and they just can't imagine saying anything bad against each other. That's basically all I think on it. Do you think I'm being overly harsh, Kevin?
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 143 for the 14th of September 2022. So I'm sitting here with Kevin, and this is our first annual question and answer episode of the Here's How podcast. Don't have a guest specifically. Actually, we have lots of guests. It's the listeners. We've got a bunch of questions in. We're going to try and get through as many of them as possible. I have a long list on the screen in front of me. And Kevin, you're going to try and keep me moving along?
Okay, I'll keep the time there, William. Make sure you don't rant for too long.
Okay, well, let's hear the first question from Nicholas.
Hi William, congratulations on the podcast and thanks very much for the invitation to ask a question. I always wondered what your opinion was on cultural institutions in Ireland like Éistóna and the RHA, and I often thought if you could get a guest on to talk about those, it would be great. My opinion is that you've essentially got what amounts to a peerage, which is self-elected and pretty much unaccountable, and they would corner the top end of the arts market for themselves, and they don't get much, if any, scrutiny in the media. That would be my view on it. I'd be very interested if you could think of anyone that would be worth talking to about that and what your own opinion is.
Well, I'll give you my own opinion in a moment. I think one thing that's maybe a problem on that is that I'm just kind of a Philistine and I don't know that much about the arts. Nicholas there mentioned the Royal Hibernian Academy and Éistóna. I'm not so sure exactly what the RHA does. I think it's kind of artists, support for artists. Éistóna is a similar thing for literature, and they get a big lump of taxpayers' money. And I think the perception is, Kevin, am I right, that all the lovies hand out the money to each other and it's quite a cosy little arrangement, and if you know the right people, you're more likely to get a grant? Is that the public perception, Kevin?
I'm as much of a Philistine as you, and I say that's the public perception of, these arts institutions generally. I don't know if that's particularly an Irish phenomenon. Mm-hmm. I don't know, is there a country that does it well? I don't really know.
Okay. I think actually when Nicholas says that, when he compares it to the honours system in the UK, obviously he's referring to there, I think he might be correct, maybe more correct than he intends to be, because of the huge amount of corruption that you get in the honour system in the UK. And we're seeing now that there's basically a price list for how much you have to donate to the Conservative Party in order to get one level of an honour, and then to get into the House of Lords, you have to donate that much more. I can kind of see a very hardcore monetarist excuse for saying, we should wipe out all of this. And every once in a while you get a Tory MP saying that, Arts Council grants should go to bingo halls and not to opera. But we would really be, I think, a very Philistine nation. Not just me being a Philistine, we would be a very Philistine nation if we didn't have any high arts.
Hi William, Adam Hallisey here, submitting a question for the Q&A episode you're running. I'm wondering, as a prolific and long-time podcaster with a series dealing a great deal in domestic Irish issues, how you think the Irish podcast scene, in particular of a political or an economic or a current affairs nature, differs from those that we see in the UK or the US and other places. It seems to me, for example, that while the platform of podcasting in other places has launched new political commentary careers, many of the most political popular podcasts in Ireland are run by already well-established institutions such as the Irish Times, the Independent and others, and also well-established individuals such as David McWilliams. Do you think that it's more difficult to sustain a current affairs podcast in Ireland without entering it with an already large audience? And if so, do you think that at least partly this is down to a relative lack of interest in such issues?
Yes and no to those questions in that order. So yes, it's definitely more difficult, and no, it's not down to a lack of interest. It's down to market size. I think anyway, if you are in the United States, you have a population that's maybe 75 times larger than Ireland. Even if you're in Britain, you're in a population that's 15 times larger than Ireland. And of course, we speak the same language as those two countries, which means that if we want to have a very opinionated and maybe very entertaining podcaster, we can just pick up stuff from Britain and from the US in a way that, for example, a small market like Greece beside a big market like Turkey, that doesn't happen because there's a language barrier. The same maybe with Portugal and Spain. But no, I don't think it's down to a lack of interest. I think it's down to a lack of people. And that's why, the main movers are people who have a big name already. I think we don't have a big name, Kevin, but we are very, very slightly famous, are we?
Slightly famous. I was going to say I agree with you about the fact that it's down to market size. I don't know. I'm not sure that are there a great number of podcasts that are not from people that are not independently famous. In, for example, the UK, I'm thinking of the podcasts I know of, Reasons to be Cheerful. Mm-hmm. Ed Miliband comes from politics, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. There's a lot of podcasts from people who are well known from, outside from, reasons other than podcasting. So,
yeah, podcasting. But also, I think Adam is right. For example, you would have the Joe Rogans, you would have the Roman Mars, and all of these people, for example, in the US, who I think Joe Rogan, maybe a little before podcasting, was known, but the overwhelming reason why they are known is because of their podcast. So that does happen in much larger markets. I don't think it's even possible, to be honest, in Ireland.
So here's my question for the podcast. Why has the government not closed down or legally pursued the quarries that caused the defective concrete block scandal that is going to cost taxpayers an estimated $2.7 billion and is likely to rise in the future? That's despite the Minister, Darragh O'Brien, saying that they were going to pursue offenders.
That's about the Pirate. We did a big story on that. We interviewed the PRO of the Pyrite Action Group in Donegal, and I think that question is really pertinent. And I'm not a lawyer, but there is a legal route. If the government is compensating people for having pyrite in their houses, it would seem to me to be possible that they could do that on the condition that each of the householders signs over to the state the right to pursue for damages the quarries who supplied this. And that's not happening. And I think anybody who knows anything about Ireland knows that the deference to the building industry is simply unbelievable. We supposedly don't have the Fianna Fáil tent at the Galway races anymore, but I think that culture is continuing, and it's the friends of people in power. And of course these quarries would be entirely put out of business if they were sued for the amount of damage they've done, and it's just not the done thing to do that to your friends. Am I a conspiracy theorist, Kevin?
No, I don't think so. I certainly can't think of a better explanation for that.
And of course, it was Pádraig Flynn, a Fianna Fáil minister, who abolished the testing that would have caught that and that would have prevented that problem from happening in the first place. And it was all done, moved over to self-regulation, which just never happened. And very poor quality product was supplied in order to make blocks. And down the line, that meant that thousands of people's houses particularly on the West Coast are falling apart. And I'm just an utter cynic on that. I can't really say any more on that. So I'll move on to a question that we got in from Nigel O'Mahony. Why is every institution of the state acting against the interests of its people by deliberately creating and exacerbating the conditions for a housing crisis? I don't know if that's meant to be a rhetorical question, and I don't think it is precisely true, but I think in a broader sense, it's absolutely true. And we have just unbelievably bad policy, and we have a housing crisis. Nobody with any sanity in them can imagine that crisis can be solved other than by providing a huge number of new appropriate housing, that's to say appropriate size, appropriate place, and so forth. We need a huge increase in the supply of appropriate housing. And if we got the increase in supply of appropriate housing, we wouldn't need any other fixes, because that would fix the problem. And I just hang my head in despair when I see things like first-time buyer grants and people pushing policies, all sorts of policies, for example, to give people more credit, to give people 30 and 40-year mortgages, to give people shared equity so that the state pays for half of the property. That's just pumping more money to supply a fixed amount of housing. And the inevitable result of that is that it increases the price of housing. And shockingly, that just seems to be exactly to the benefit of the Friends of Fianna Fáil. And I think one thing that Nigel might note is that our current housing minister, Mr. O'Brien, is from Dublin Fingal constituency, previously known as Dublin North, and he took over the seat of Ray Burke, who was previously a housing minister. And Ray Burke, as we know, spent time in prison for taking bribes or for failing to pay tax on the bribes that he received, in particular one in connection with Century Radio. And I don't think anybody with any knowledge of Irish politics would be naive enough to believe that was the only bribe that Mr. Burke took. But if you look at the policies of Darragh O'Brien, it's very, very hard to find a policy that Darragh O'Brien is pursuing that is inconsistent with him wanting to just enrich the building industry. There's simply nothing he's doing that isn't consistent with that. As far as I can see, that is the problem. And until we fix it, it'll stay broken.
Hey, William. This is Dave McGeehan in Naas, County Kildare, a long-time listener, first-time caller. So my question to you is, how would you characterise the ideologies of the main political parties in Ireland, and can you give examples of how these manifest in government or may do so in the future government? In my view, only really Social Democrats and Labour and maybe the Greens represent the ethos. Obviously, these are very small parties, but my theory is that if the numbers worked out that they were kingmakers after the next election, that a party like Fianna Fáil are sufficiently ideologically malleable, and the mood of the country is such that the small social democratic parties could, with strong leadership, wield disproportionate influence in government, like the PDs did in the past, albeit from the opposite side of the spectrum. So is this just fantasy, am I correct? And for full disclosure, I'm a Social Democrats member. Thank you.
Yes, Dave. Yes, I'm sorry. It's just fantasy. And I have a huge amount of sympathy with you. And I know that a lot of people, very idealistic people, join the Social Democrats and want to, they join the Social Democrats for the sole reason that they want to give their time to make the country a better place. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the Social Democrats, but I think the people are very sincere. But the one thing I would say to Dave is that I've hung around a lot of elections and kind of talked with various candidates of various levels of success. And I have never once met any candidate, even the most humble independent who is going to get 25 votes at the end of the day. There was never a candidate in a Dáil election who didn't secretly believe that come election night, they would be proclaimed Taoiseach by the people of Ireland by some way. Every single one of them, about 500 candidates typically run in an Irish general election. I bet every single one of them thinks they're going to be Taoiseach after the election, whether they admit it or not. And one person, again, at an election count, said to me something which I thought was very appropriate. She said that despair I can handle. It's the hope that really kills you. And people, put their heart and soul. A lot of people outside politics don't know this. People put their heart and soul into campaigning in elections, and they really want to believe that what they're going for is going to be successful. But just on numbers, add together Labour, Social Democrats and Greens, what they will have after the next election, there's a cat's chance in hell they'll be kingmakers. It's just not going to happen. But I just want to go to the first part of Dave's question, because I thought that was quite interesting. It was like the political position of the Irish political parties, and he mentioned that the Greens, Labour and Social Democrats are all largely social democratic, and that's more or less true. The problem in Irish politics is that for 90 years we had the two largest parties being essentially ideology free. There was no way that you could vote ideologically in most Irish elections. And I think we're in serious danger. We will have the three largest parties being ideologically vapid. And people, might demur that and say that Sinn Féin looks pretty solidly on the left. But if you go to rural Ireland, or if you scratch the surface of Sinn Féin, for example, has said, yeah, they're in favour of climate action. But you just ask them, hang on a second, what are you going to actually do? And they realise that they have to say something that's going to annoy some constituency or other. All of a sudden, they get incredibly vague. And for 60 or 70 years, Fianna Fáil essentially ran a policy of being centre-left in the cities and centre-right in the countryside. And it seems like Sinn Féin might be doing that and just taking over that Fianna Fáil space. So, yeah, maybe it's good that we have not so much ideology in Irish politics. Maybe it's bad, but that's what it is. And the next question comes from Shane Chung.
Hello, William. My question for you is about media bias in Ireland. More specifically, a bias in favour of the establishment parties from media outlets such as the Irish Times, Independent, RTE, etc. And I would like to hear your opinion on where you think this bias comes from, if you agree that it exists in the first place. And do you think it's passive, in that these bodies are just hiring from a limited group of people and they just all happen to think the same? Or do you think it's a bit more partisan and upholding the status quo is mutually beneficial for all those involved? Keep up the good work.
Yeah, I used to be a fan of Noam Chomsky, and I'm not a fan of Noam Chomsky anymore, but still Noam Chomsky has said some incredibly clever things throughout his career. And I can't remember what journalist it was that he answered, but he said to one journalist, I absolutely believe that you believe what you're saying, that you honestly hold those supposedly moderate centre-right views, but I also believe you wouldn't have the job you have if you didn't believe that. And I think that's kind of how it works for the Irish media, that the people with the right opinions are the people who get in there. And it's worth noting, I think, I won't put it any more strongly than that Ireland is a small, small country, and that all the journalists know all the politicians. And that has a big effect. And the media market isn't big enough to annoy a lot of people and to lose a lot of friends. And if I would very humbly say, I think that's where our podcast comes in sometimes, because if somebody never picks up the phone from us again, we're okay, maybe it's a disappointment, but that's the way it goes. We're not really, stuck for content from that. But yes, I would agree, there absolutely is a media bias in favour of a very generalised, amorphous establishment. And that doesn't really annoy me so much. These things happen. But what really annoys me is that so many journalists don't see that that's the case, and they really think that they are kicking against the system when in reality they are, controlled opposition. Kevin, what do you think?
No, I was actually going to ask, is there a particular issue where you think this kind of, I guess, media groupthink is evident?
Yeah, well, we featured one on the podcast ages ago where, and I'm not going to say the name because I can't remember exactly which Irish Times journalist it was pleading the case of Maria Bailey and saying that because Maria Bailey had suffered bad publicity, she should not. This was because she had fraudulently sued a hotel where she had gotten drunk and was up to hijinks and had allegedly suffered an injury. It was very plain that the injury she suffered was either non-existent or drastically less severe than she had alleged. And she was suing this hotel. This is, a huge problem for Irish businesses, liability insurance, because for various reasons, that insurance is incredibly expensive, and that suit would have cost that hotel a huge amount of money. Harry McGee said on the Irish Times podcast that because Maria Bailey had been publicly criticised, she should not suffer the indignity of losing, I think, a position on some irrelevant Dáil committee. The bottom line is that Maria Bailey committed a crime. And nobody would even talk about it. Maria Bailey conspired to pervert the course of justice. She gave false statements to her solicitor in an effort to wring money out of a hotel who had done nothing wrong. And I think that's exactly the sort of thing that happened. People, the entire media political side in Ireland are essentially friends, and they just can't imagine saying anything bad against each other. That's basically all I think on it. Do you think I'm being overly harsh, Kevin?
No, I think that was a well-chosen example. I always thought that the Irish Times seemed to me very Anglo-Irish, I suppose. But it was a legacy, I guess, of its Protestant roots, I guess.
I guess it is. We have one other written question from Conor Reardon. Conor, whose handle is Logical _ Conor, he's a fairly prolific tweeter, and I think it's fair to say that I think he's a Fine Gael supporter. He's certainly a government supporter. I don't say that in any negative way, but just to kind of place that. And in the context of the housing crisis, Kevin wrote in the question, how does the fact that 83,662 first-time buyers secured homes in the last 3 years sit with the narrative that first-time buyers are locked out of the market? And to me, that's a reasonable question. If 83,000 people have been able to buy their homes, does that not indicate that that is possible? And yes, I guess. But the problem is that we need something like 50,000 homes per year to stand still, because with the population structure that we have and the rate of family formation and so forth, we need about 50,000 homes to be available to first-time buyers in order to stand still, to keep the home ownership rate from going down and to allow people to get their own homes. And I have to say, this is not just a financial issue. There are people in their 20s, in their 30s, people who are pushing into their 40s, who can't move out of their parental homes. That means they can't start families. They can't live a normal adult life because we don't have houses for them of an appropriate size in an appropriate place. And the problem, and I accept what Conor says, but the problem with what Conor says is that deficit, so there's about 23 or 24,000 first-time buyers managing to buy a house every year. But that means that there's about 26 or 27,000 people who are coming into the demographic who need a starter home and who do not get it. And that's a cumulative problem. So the people, let's say 26,000 people who didn't get a house and should have last year, is on top of the 26,000 people who didn't get a house and should have this year, the year before, and the year before and the year before. And we have had several years of that. So we're building up and we're going into the hundreds of thousands of either people or more likely young couples or young families who need a home and are not getting it. And we have, the problem is land price. And I'm just looking at one report here. This is from the industry group, the Irish Institution of Property. And they're saying the break-even cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in Ireland is close to €450,000. And if you even just put 10% profit on that for the developer, that's €500,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, like really the most humble home that a young couple could possibly be expected to live in. That's just insane. Everything that is required to build a house can be put on the back of a truck or on the back of a Ryanair flight from Poland, except land. Land prices are the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, look, I don't know anyone who's anywhere close to owning a house. I'm 27. It's so. Connor's question is it's inviting me to not believe my lying eyes, so to speak. It's clear that it's very difficult to get impossible, really, nearly for people in my age cohort to get property.
Hi, Kevin and William. It's Alan here. So my question to you is, to what extent are the culture wars, the so-called culture wars, and the issues involved in that, such as the trans issue, such as certain equality issues, are potentially overstated in the Irish media, compared to something very basic, such as housing or employment? That are these issues as significant in the real world compared to how significant that they might appear on social media, and how they seem to have gained such prominence on various social media platforms? Okay, thanks guys. Enjoying the show. Best of luck. Bye.
I 100% agree with Alan. I think that those, you might say culture wars issues, but those Twitterati issues are absolutely bypassing the huge bulk of the population. And because those people who campaign very hard on those issues, not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with them campaigning on that, but because they're on Twitter and because politicians and journalists are on Twitter, the political journalistic circle vastly overestimates their importance. And I think one political party knows that. That's Sinn Féin. They know that the bread and butter issues, housing and cost of living, are where the votes are at, and they're going to win on that basis. Do you think I'm right, Kevin?
I'd say so. I don't know if the if the social media diagnosis is correct. Whenever I open the papers, there's always, if you go to the opinion section, someone talking about woke or cancel culture, or its many, many synonyms. So I'm not sure if that's the origin. I think that people in who are very political like to talk about these things, maybe because, maybe it's because, for people who talk about politics, this is the one major occupational hazard you face, is that you have an opinion that's unpopular and gets you some blowback. And so that becomes the biggest issue. So yeah, I don't know if social media is the driving force. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that those, as you call it, woke issues, or those particular culture war issues, I think they bypass the huge majority of the population, and their importance to the population is vastly overestimated because of the amount of time they occupy on Twitter. Most Irish adults, as Alan says, don't go near Twitter. And I think actually most people who do have an account use it for very specific things and don't engage in that. So that kind of political Twitter is even far smaller than that again. And I agree. And I think that's a weakness of journalism. We need a headline. We need to fill up the paper, switch on Twitter. What are some people arguing about? That's obviously what's interesting to people. Not the case. Not the case. I don't agree with that at all.
The recent issue we've seen in getting taxis arises, in my view, from the decision of the Commission for Taxi Regulation to refuse licences to new vehicles unless they are very expensive wheelchair accessible vehicles. This decision was continued by the NTA when power transferred to them in 2009. The result is no new regular taxi or hackney licenses have been issued in over 10 years. Notwithstanding the merits or demerits of such a policy, is it right that such decisions are outsourced to agencies of the state, and who do we hold accountable if that goes wrong?
Yeah, that's got a whole lot of interesting things in there. So I want to go to the last point first, and I'll wonder if you'll agree with me on this, Kevin. I think that the reason we have so many quangos and so many agencies, and we have the Tobacco Control Office and to deal with cigarettes, and we have this taxi regulator, or the transport regulator, I think as it is now, and there's almost every aspect of life has one of these. And as I see it, the reason that these exist is because ministers get into power. They, as one particular politician who had also worked in the private sector described it to me in private, is like when they walk in the door of the institution this person was elected to, when they walk in the door, it's like trying to run through honey. Everything moves so slowly, nobody wants to change anything, and it's that the amount of institutional resistance is enormous. And the reaction, the way that ministers cope with that is they say they've got a rake of civil servants in front of them who are all giving them very good reasons why nothing should be done ever about anything. And the way that they get around that, they can't get these people on side, so they just sideline them, and they create the Office for Tobacco Control or the Transport Regulator or whatever of one of these literally I think we're into thousands of quangos now. All of those quangos have to have a board on 6-figure salaries. All of those quangos have to have a whole suite of employment support services, have a HR department, contract out their website to somebody who just might be the friend of somebody working in there, contract out a whole load of things. But in the scheme of things, they typically perform better than government departments. And that's why ministers are doing them. Ministers see, if they get 4 years in office, they're lucky. And if they spend all 4 of those years trying to reform the arcane practices in their department, they will appear to have achieved nothing, and quite likely they will achieve nothing. We had previously the catastrophe of the taxi licenses being run by the local authorities that was entirely corrupted. Taxi licenses were being used to launder drug money and proceeds of crime. And one of the things that they did, because the criminals had influence on the politicians who were controlling this, they made sure that no new taxi licenses were created, which meant that by the very early 2000s, taxi licenses were changing hands for £100,000. That'd be like €125,000 just for the plate, not a taxi. You don't get anything, you just get the license. And then that was forced, liberalised by the courts. They said that this was unconstitutional, which was kind of obvious. I wasn't aware that there was now another way, and it seems there's more than one way to skin a cat, to start limiting the number of taxi licenses by putting in a requirement to have a very highly specified taxi. I would be deeply suspicious that that is being done in favour of restricting competition in the market rather than actually providing a service perhaps for people who need a wheelchair taxi. And as Robert puts it, the proof of that is in the pudding. If no taxi licenses are being issued, then obviously that isn't doing anything to protect people who need wheelchair taxis. Obviously, it's useful to have a proportion of the taxis wheelchair accessible. But if the regulation supposedly attempting to do that is just resulting in no new taxi licenses being issued, well, then that's obviously defeating itself, and it's unlikely that that was the true purpose of the rule in the first place. And I can see Kevin waving at me, telling me that I'm going over time on that. So we're on to the last question. This is from Alfonso Bonilla, who I believe is an architect, who says, hi, William, I couldn't really help myself, so I have 3 questions for your podcast. Maybe one of them sparks interest. I don't know if we can get to all 3 of them, because I want to keep the podcast relatively tight. But the first one he says is, do you have an opinion on how the revelations surrounding the irregularities by senior members of On Board Planola should be interpreted in terms of On Board Planola's impartiality? And the answer is yes. Yes, I do have an opinion. Did you expect that answer, Kevin?
I'd be shocked if you didn't have an opinion on this.
Yeah, and my opinion is this, is that Ireland is too small a country to have the setup like on board Planola. Ireland is a country of small towns and small social groups. And if you're looking at planning permission being granted within a local authority, the bottom line is that in a huge chunk of the decisions, the person making the decision is pretty likely to bump into the person who is affected by the position as they're going about their business wherever they live. And with On Board Planola, clearly there's been extremely serious irregularities. I don't want to get us into legal trouble by free associating my words on this, but I don't think anybody can deny that there's some very serious problems there. And Ireland has to implement a solution to this problem. And the solution is this. It is that we need to eliminate discretion. Every law that mentions opinion, every law that mentions adequate and sufficient, every law that mentions due consideration needs to be changed. We just can't, because of the nature of Ireland, we just can't have a situation where you can appoint somebody who you then say the decision will be made by them and they will have due regard to this, that and the other, and they will take adequate consideration of something else, and they will ensure that sufficient this or that is done. Because when you have those soft, unfalsifiable opinions becoming actual decisions, in Ireland that just won't work. Because social circles are so small that the bottom line is what you're asking, and actually this is unlikely to work really in any country, because what you're doing is you have public officials, civil servants or whatever, of relatively ordinary means. They're not poor, but they're not buying super yachts. They're relatively ordinary people, maybe who've done fairly well in their career, who are making decisions that can make people hundreds of millions of euro. In some cases, it can make people billionaires. And it is just hopelessly naive to imagine that money that they can effectively grant to other people won't go back round in a circle to come to influence that decision in the first place. It just isn't going to happen. It's just inevitable that money will influence the decision by whatever method. Perhaps because somebody gets a huge stack of 200 euro notes in an envelope. Perhaps, though, it's for something that the person who's making the decision believes is more of an innocent thing. But my feeling on that particular question is that in Ireland we need legislation to say not that somebody must ensure that adequate and sufficient this, that and the other is done. We need the legislation to give exact numbers, and we're talking about planning here, so we need set down in legislation, if your property is more than X meters from this list of town and city centres, then you can have this number of meters height of a property and these number of floors. And you essentially need to abolish all of those inspectors and all of those decision makers and set up a system that a reasonably well-trained chimpanzee could look at the list of rules, see an application, and be able to say with 100% certainty this application meets these requirements or not. Alfonso also asks, could these irregularities be dealt with to reinstate confidence in the planning process? Answer no, for the reason that I say before. As long as we have these very soft decisions being made by people of ordinary means who have the capacity to make other people vastly wealthy, That's just not a system that can work. And I know that this is and we're going to finish on this, a huge issue for Alfonso about what are called SPPRs. SPPRs are specific planning policy requirements, which are essentially the legal rules under which things like build to rent apartments are being built. And these terrible, terrible blocks, which are exempt from a huge rake of planning rules. They're all that's being built these days. That's all the apartments that are being built. I think 96 or something % of all apartments currently under construction are under this particular exception, which means that, for example, the requirement to have a good amount of windows in an apartment doesn't exist, or the requirement for the size of the apartment doesn't exist. The requirement for open space in the apartment block doesn't exist, or even a balcony. And basically, what you're doing is you are condemning people to live in apartments where there is so little light that you have to leave the lights on all day, and where they have to fry onions, iron shirts, change nappies, and sleep all in the same room. And we're one of the wealthiest nations on earth. I don't think there's any reason in the world why a large section of the population should have to live like that. Kevin, have I ranted enough?
Yeah, well, I hope that Alfonso was happy with your answer, because that was way over the amount of time we allotted to each question. It does seem to me that we often come back to many of the issues are influenced by the fact that Ireland is a small country. We mentioned that a couple of times with regards to planning, and it's not just ourselves that are saying that. I know Fintan O'Toole does sometimes talked about that as an issue. Coziness. Mm-hmm. I think it would be comparative analysis of how maybe other similarly sized countries do things would be a useful thing to do, like Denmark and New Zealand, how they kind of sort the issues that we have identified as being influenced by the size of Ireland as a polity.
Let's leave it there, Kevin. We will perhaps defer to the listeners to let us know whether or not we should do another question and answer podcast at any stage in the future.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website to read all about the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and get in touch with us if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. We don't get anything like what other Irish podcasters get that I could mention. We're a much smaller podcast, but it pays for things like web hosting. Kevin and I basically do the podcast for free. But if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a Dublin bus ticket once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. I'll be talking to Kelly Armstrong, the Alliance Party MLA, on the next show, which will be released on the 28th of September. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.